The storm did not arrive with a warning. It arrived with a verdict. Up on the ridge, the world had been reduced to two colors, the blinding white of the snow and the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The wind did not howl, it screamed, a high, thin sound that stripped the heat from anything living within minutes. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his A-frame cabin, watching the tree line. He was 42, a man carved from silence and hard labor. 10 years as a combat tracker in special operations had taught him to read landscapes like books. And tonight, the landscape was telling him to bolt the door. He had come to the Yukon to forget the sound of gunfire, trading violence for the brutal honesty of the winter. Here, if you made a mistake, the cold simply took you. It was impersonal. It was fair. He was about to turn back inside when he saw it. It was not a movement, exactly. It was a disruption in the pattern of the falling snow, a dark shape, struggling against the grade of the slope about 50 yards out. Elias narrowed his eyes. Bears were sleeping. Wolves moved faster. This was something else. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into 6 inches of fresh powder. He didn't call out, he just walked, his body cutting through the wind with practiced efficiency. As he got closer, the shape resolved into 2 figures. One was on the ground, a heap of dark wool and exhaustion. The other was standing over it, a statue of black and tan fur defying the gale. A German shepherd. Massive. Its coat was matted with ice, its breath puffing out in rapid, desperate clouds. When Elias approached, the dog did not retreat. It lowered its head, ears flattened against its skull, and let out a rumble that vibrated through the snow. It wasn't aggression. It was a warning. Come closer, and you pay the price. Easy, Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't stop, but he slowed his pace, showing his empty hands. The dog's amber eyes locked onto him. Elias saw the tremor in the animal's hind legs. The beast was freezing to death, yet it stood its ground between the stranger and the fallen figure. I'm not the enemy, Elias murmured, his gaze shifting to the snow. Buried beneath the drift was an elderly woman. She was unconscious, her face pale as parchment, her lips tinged with a dangerous blue. She wore a coat that was too thin for a city winter, let alone the mountains. Elias looked back at the dog. She dies if we stay here. The dog seemed to understand. The growl died in its throat. It stepped aside, just an inch, shivering violently. Elias moved fast. He scooped the woman up. She felt terrifyingly light, like a bundle of dry sticks, and turned back toward the cabin. The German shepherd followed. It limped heavily on its front right leg, dragging the paw through the snow, but it did not lag behind. It stayed exactly at Elias's heel, guarding his blind spot. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of warmth. The cast-iron stove was roaring. Elias laid the woman on the leather sofa and immediately went to work. He stripped off her frozen outer layers, wrapped her in heavy wool blankets, and rubbed warmth into her hands. The dog collapsed on the rug near the door. It didn't sleep. It lay with its head on its paws, those intelligent amber eyes tracking Elias's every move. Elias noticed the dog's collar. No tags, but there was something woven into the nylon. A tactical weave. This wasn't a stray. This was a working dog. He heated a bowl of broth and brought it to the woman. Her eyelids fluttered. Drink, Elias commanded softly. She opened her eyes. They were gray, clouded with confusion, but as she focused on Elias, sharp fear spiked through them. She tried to scramble back, gasping. Easy, Elias said, stepping back to give her space. You almost froze. You're safe. The truck, she rasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones. Did they see the truck? Elias frowned. There's no truck, just you and the dog. The woman gripped the blanket, her knuckles white. She looked at the window, where the night had turned the glass into a black mirror. They aren't just behind me, she whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the cold. They are hunting us. Elias looked at the dog. The animal had lifted its head, its ears swiveling toward the door, listening to something louder than the wind. Elias stood up and walked to the wall where his rifle hung. He didn't know who they were, but he knew the look in a survivor's eyes. He checked the chamber. Who is hunting you? Elias asked. The old woman took a shuddering breath. The men who bury the truth, she said, and I have the shovel. Outside, through the screaming wind, Elias heard it. The faint, unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel, cutting through the storm. Someone else was on the mountain. Elias moved with the fluidity of a shadow. He didn't run to the window. He slid against the wall, killing the interior lights with a single flip of a switch. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the orange glow of the wood stove breathing behind the grate. "Stay down," Elias ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. The old woman slid off the sofa, pressing herself into the gap between the furniture and the wall. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She moved like someone who had been practicing how to disappear. The German shepherd, whose name Elias still didn't know, limped silently to the center of the room. It stood statue still, its nose pointing toward the door, a low vibration building in its chest that sounded like a distant drill. Outside, the crunch of tires ceased. An engine idled, a heavy diesel thrum battling the wind, then the slam of a heavy door. Elias unholstered the sidearm he kept in the drawer near the entry one, a Sig Sauer P226. He checked it by feel. He didn't raise it. He kept it held against his thigh, concealed by the doorframe. Heavy footsteps crunched on the porch stairs. 1, 2, 3. A pause. Then a knock. It was a polite knock. 3 distinct raps. Rhythmic. Calm. Elias waited 3 seconds, letting the cold seep in through the cracks, before he unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door 6 inches. The storm tried to force its way in, but the man standing on the porch blocked most of it. He was tall, wearing a pristine gray parka with a fur hood. His face was clean-shaven, his eyes hidden behind amber tactical glasses even in the dark. He didn't look like a thug, he looked like a solution. That made him dangerous. "Evening," the man said. His voice was smooth, polished, the kind of voice that sold insurance or buried secrets. "Sorry to disturb you, the weather is turning hellish." Elias said nothing. He just stared, his blue eyes flat and unreadable. The man smiled, a tight expression that didn't move his cheeks. "I'm looking for my mother. She wandered off from the care facility in town about 4 hours ago. Dementia. She's confused. Likely thinks people are after her." He leaned in slightly, conspiratorial. "We tracked her footprints to your ridge before the snow covered them. Is she here?" It was a perfect lie. Reasonable, urgent, emotional. Elias might have believed it, except for 2 things. First, the woman inside hadn't flinched like a dementia patient. She had hidden like a target. Second, the dog. From the darkness behind Elias, the German shepherd launched itself at the crack in the door. It didn't bark. It slammed its muzzle into the gap, snarling with a ferocity that sprayed saliva onto the stranger's pristine coat. It was a kill noise, pure, unadulterated hatred. The stranger flinched, his hand dropping instinctively to his waist to a holster beneath the parka. Elias saw the move. He saw the training. "She's not here," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. The stranger recovered his composure, but the smile was gone. "Sir, if she is in there, she needs medical attention. She is dangerous to herself." "I said," Elias repeated, stepping forward so his chest filled the gap. "She's not here, and neither are you." He let the heavy oak door swing shut, but he didn't latch it immediately. He listened. On the porch, the man stood silent for a long moment. Then Elias heard a voice, muffled by the wind, speaking into a radio. "Target confirmed. We have an obstacle." The footsteps retreated. The truck door slammed, the engine revved, and the vehicle backed away, fading into the whiteout. Elias locked the bolt and turned back to the room. The dog was pacing now, whining high in its throat, looking from the window to the woman. Elias walked to the stove and lit a kerosene lantern, keeping the wick low. He crouched beside the woman. "They're gone for now," he said. "The road is icing over. They can't bring a team up here until dawn." The woman pulled herself up, shivering. That was Vance. He's the head of security for Cobalt Mining. Elias knew the name. Everyone in the Yukon knew Cobalt. They owned half the politicians and all of the land rights. "He said you have dementia," Elias said, testing her. The woman reached into her coat, her trembling fingers fumbling with the lining. She pulled out a small waterproof hard drive. It was dented, as if it had been stepped on. "I was their accountant for 30 years, she said, her voice gaining steel. "I don't have dementia. I have the ledger. I know where the bodies are buried, literally." She looked at Elias, her eyes clear and desperate. "They caused the landslide in Sector 4 last month, the one that killed the 3 miners. It wasn't an accident. It was a demolition to save money on excavation. I have the emails signed by Vance." Elias looked at the hard drive, then at the rifle on the wall. He had come to the mountain to avoid war, but war, it seemed, had a habit of knocking on his door. "What's the dog's name?" Elias asked, breaking the tension. "Major," she said softly. He belonged to one of the miners who died. He found me when I ran. I think he knows what they did." Elias looked at Major. The dog was sitting by the window again, watching the dark tree line. The animal was hurt, exhausted, and outgunned, but he wasn't leaving his post. Elias felt a familiar shift in his chest. The cold indifference he had cultivated for years was cracking. "Get some sleep," Elias said, standing up and checking the load in his pistol. "Major and I will take the first watch." "And tomorrow?" she asked. Elias looked out into the storm. Tomorrow, they stopped being polite. The dawn did not bring light. It brought exposure. The sun rose as a pale, bruised smear behind the gray clouds, illuminating the ridge in flat, unforgiving detail. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a gunshot. Inside the cabin, Elias moved with methodical quiet. He had spent the remaining dark hours turning the home into a bunker. The heavy oak table was turned on its side against the main window. The kitchen knives were staged near the back exit. The lantern was extinguished. The woman she had told him her name was Martha sat huddled in the corner of the kitchen, clutching the hard drive like a rosary. "They haven't come back," she whispered, her voice brittle. "They never left," Elias replied, not looking away from the crack in the window shutters. "They're just positioning." Major, the German shepherd, lay by the front door. The dog had not slept. His head rested on his paws, but his amber eyes were wide open, tracking dust motes in the dim light. Every few minutes, a low, vibrating growl would ripple through his chest, too quiet to be heard, but Elias could feel the tension in the room. Elias checked his watch. 7 o'clock in the morning. "Why are they waiting?" Martha asked. "They want it to look like an accident," Elias said. "A house fire, carbon monoxide, a fall down the ravine. If they storm in shooting, it raises questions. If we disappear quietly, it's just another tragedy in the Yukon." Suddenly, Major stood up. The movement was abrupt. The dog ignored the pain in his injured leg, his hackles rising in a jagged line down his spine. He didn't look at the door this time. He looked at the floorboards near the heating vent. He barked. A single, sharp, explosive sound. Elias didn't question it. He dove toward Martha, grabbing her arm. "Move, now." "What?" "Go." He hauled her toward the back door just as a soft whoosh sound echoed from beneath the cabin. A second later, the air inside turned thick and acrid. Smoke. Not wood smoke, chemical smoke. They were pumping something into the ventilation intake outside. "Tear gas," Elias coughed, pulling the collar of his sweater over his nose. "They're flushing us out." He kicked the back door open. The cold air hit them like a physical blow. Elias pushed Martha out onto the small rear deck, his pistol raised. Major limped out behind them, sneezing violently, shaking his head to clear the stinging gas. The rear of the cabin faced a steep incline of dense pine forest. It was their only cover. "Run for the trees," Elias commanded. As Martha scrambled over the railing, a crack split the morning air. Wood splintered on the doorframe inches from Elias's head. A suppressor. A sniper on the ridge. Elias dropped to a crouch, firing 2 blind shots toward the tree line to suppress the shooter, then vaulted over the railing, landing in the snow beside Major. "We can't outrun them in the open," Elias gritted out, scanning the white expanse. "Not with the dog's leg." He looked at Major. The dog was favoring his right paw heavily, panting, eyes watering from the gas, but he looked up at Elias with a fierce, expectant intelligence. "What is the mission?" Elias grabbed Martha's shoulder. "The creek bed, half a mile down. The banks are steep. They provide cover from the ridge. Can you make it?" Martha looked at the burning cabin, then at the blood spotting the snow where Major's paw had scraped the ice. She nodded, her fear hardening into something useful. "Lead the way," she said. They moved into the timberline, just as the front windows of the cabin blew out, shattering from the heat building inside. The fire had started. Elias didn't look back at the life he was leaving behind. He was focused on the tracks they were leaving and the snow tracks that Vance and his team would be following within minutes. But Elias had a tracker of his own. As they descended into the dense forest, Major suddenly stopped. He didn't look behind them. He looked to the left, into a cluster of windfall rocks, and went perfectly still. Elias froze. He knew that stillness. It meant ambush. Vance hadn't just attacked the cabin. He had set a perimeter. Elias signaled Martha to get down behind a cedar trunk. He crouched beside the dog, his hand resting on Major's thick neck. The fur was bristling. "Where?" Elias whispered. Major turned his head slowly, his nose pointing directly at a shadowed divot between two boulders about 30 yards away. Elias raised his pistol, leveling it at the empty space. "Come out," Elias called out, his voice flat and deadly. "Or I send the dog." For a long second, there was only the sound of the wind in the pines. Then, a shape detached itself from the rocks, a man in winter camouflage holding a radio. He raised his hands, but his eyes weren't on Elias's gun. They were on the dog, wide with fear. "Don't release him," the man stammered. "Drop the radio," Elias ordered. The man hesitated. That was a mistake. The hesitation cost him. As the man's fingers twitched toward the radio, Major launched. The German Shepherd hit the scout's chest with the force of a battering ram. There was no bark, just the wet thud of impact and a sharp gasp of air leaving lungs. The man went down hard into the snow, the radio flying from his grip. Major pinned him instantly, jaws clamped inches from the man's throat, a low, rumbling growl vibrating through the scout's heavy jacket. Elias was there a second later. He didn't waste time with threats. He struck the man's temple with the butt of his pistola, single controlled blow. The scout went limp. "Good boy," Elias whispered, signaling Major to release. "Heel." Major backed away, favoring his bad leg, licking his chops. He looked at Elias, then at the unconscious man, waiting for the next command. Elias scooped up the fallen radio. It crackled. "Unit 4, check in. Do you have eyes on the target?" Elias didn't answer. He turned the volume down and clipped it to his belt. "They're closing the net," he said to Martha, who was staring at the unconscious man with wide eyes. "They have the perimeter sealed. We can't go down the mountain." "Then where?" Martha asked, her breath coming in ragged clouds. "There's nothing up there but rock and ice." "There's an old logging road," Elias said, pointing east toward a jagged ridge that cut against the sky like a broken knife. "It crosses the gorge. It hasn't been used in 20 years. The bridge is rotted, but it's the only way to the highway on the other side." "A rotted bridge?" Martha's voice wavered. "It's that or a bullet," Elias said. "Let's move." The trek was brutal. The snow was knee-deep here, untouched and heavy. Elias broke the trail, creating a wake for Martha to follow. Major brought up the rear, turning his head every few steps to check their back trail, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. Elias watched the dog closely. Major was lagging. The cold was seizing up the old injury in his leg. Every step was a labor, a visible wince, but the dog refused to stop. When Martha stumbled, falling to her knees in a drift, it was Major who nudged her shoulder with his wet nose, whining softly until she stood up again. He was herding them, protecting them. After an hour of climbing, the trees thinned. They reached the edge of the gorge. The wind here was ferocious, tearing at their clothes. Spanning the gap was the bridge's skeleton of rusted steel and gray weathered timber. It swayed slightly in the gusts, suspending 100 feet over a frozen riverbed. "My God," Martha whispered. "Step on the beams, not the planks," Elias instructed, shouting over the wind. "Don't look down." He stepped onto the structure first to test the weight. The wood groaned, shedding icicles into the abyss, but it held. He waved Martha forward. She took a step, terrified, gripping the rusted cable rail. Then, the radio on Elias's belt hissed. "All units, converge on the east ridge. We found footprints. They are heading for the gorge. Slayton, bring the rifle." Elias spun around. At the tree line they had just left, 300 yards back, a snowmobile burst into view, then another. Black shapes against the white snow, men dismounting, rifles raising. "Go," Elias roared, shoving Martha forward. "Move!" They scrambled onto the bridge, the woods slick with ice. Major scrambled behind them, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the frozen timber. A gunshot cracked. A bullet struck the steel railing inches from Elias's hand, sending a spray of rust into his face. "Don't stop," Elias yelled, drawing his pistol and firing 2 shots back toward the trees, not to hit, but to force heads down. They were halfway across when Martha's foot punched through a rotted plank. She screamed, her leg plunging through into empty air, her body jerking to a halt. She was trapped, the jagged wood biting into her shin. "Elias!" she shrieked. Elias turned back. He grabbed her arm, pulling, but she was wedged tight. On the ridge, the shooters had stopped moving. They were settling into prone positions, taking aim. Elias looked at the shooters, then at Martha, then at Major. The dog stood between them and the gunmen. He wasn't looking at Elias, he was looking at the shooters. He bared his teeth, a defiant snarl at an enemy he couldn't reach. Then Elias saw the laser dot, a red speck of light dancing across the bridge, moving toward Martha's chest. Elias didn't think. Instinct took the wheel. He threw his body over Martha, driving her flat against the icy slats just as the air cracked. Thwack! The bullet slammed into the timber inches from Martha's head, sending a shower of frozen splinters into Elias's cheek. The bridge groaned, swinging wildly under the sudden shift in weight. "Stay down!" Elias roared. He rolled onto his back, raising the Sig Sauer. The range was too far for a kill shot, but he didn't need to kill. He needed them to flinch. He fired 3 rapid rounds toward the black shapes on the ridge. The men scrambled for cover behind the snowmobiles. The laser dot vanished from Martha's back. "Major, go!" Elias shouted, pointing to the far side of the gorge. The dog hesitated. He looked at Elias, then at the enemy, torn between the command and the instinct to protect. "Go!" Elias screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. Major whined, a high, piercing sound, then turned and scrambled toward the far bank, his claws digging frantically into the ice-slicked wood. Elias holstered the gun and grabbed the rotting plank trapping Martha's leg. There was no time for gentleness. He gripped the wood with both gloved hands and heaved, the veins in his neck bulging. Snap! The wood gave way with a wet crunch. Martha screamed a raw, tearing sound as her leg pulled free. Her pant leg was shredded, dark blood already blossoming on the denim. "I've got you," Elias grunted. He hauled her to her feet, wrapping his arm around her waist. "Don't look back, just move." They stumbled forward. The bridge was a pendulum now, swinging in the gale. Another shot rang out from the ridge, pinging off the steel cable by Elias's ear. "They're finding their range," Elias hissed. 10 yards to the edge. 5. Major was already on the solid ground of the far bank. He was barking now, a deep, rhythmic command, pacing the edge of the cliff, urging them on. Elias threw Martha onto the snow of the far bank and scrambled up after her. He didn't stop to breathe. He spun around, drawing the knife from his belt-a-heavy, serrated survival blade. "What are you doing?" Martha gasped, clutching her bleeding leg. "Burning the boat," Elias said. He grabbed the thick, rusted cable anchoring the bridge to the rock face. It was frayed, weakened by decades of winter. He jammed the knife into the core of the rope and began to saw, putting his entire body weight into the motion. On the other side, the men were running toward the bridge. 2 of them. They stepped onto the planks. "Stop!" one of them yelled, raising his rifle. Elias didn't look up. He sawed. The steel strands popped. 1, 2, 3, singing like snapped violin strings. The man on the bridge took aim. Elias looked him in the eye and severed the last strand. With a sound like a thunderclap, the bridge cable whipped back. The entire structure torqued violently, twisting sideways. The wooden planks dropped away into the abyss. The gunmen scrambled backward, barely catching the edge of the far cliff, watching as the bridge swung down, crashing against the canyon wall with a deafening boom. A cloud of snow and debris rose up from the gorge. The path was gone. Elias stood up, chest heaving, the knife hanging loosely in his hand. Across the 100-foot gap, the mercenaries stood on the ridge, staring at them. The wind carried their curses away, but their anger was palpable. They couldn't cross, not without a helicopter or climbing gear. Elias turned to Martha. She was pale, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them. Major was licking the blood from her torn pant leg, his tail thumping softly against the snow. Did we win?" she stammered. Elias looked at the darkening sky. The storm was picking up again. They were on the wrong side of the mountain, miles from civilization, with no shelter, no food, and an injured woman. "No," Elias said, sheathing his knife. "We just bought time." He looked at Major. The dog's bad leg was trembling uncontrollably now. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was settling in. "We need a cave," Elias said, hoisting Martha up. "If we're not out of this wind in an hour, the bridge won't matter." He took a step, and then he stopped. Major wasn't following. The dog was standing at the edge of the gorge, looking down into the abyss where the bridge had fallen. His ears were pricked forward. He wasn't looking at the wreckage. He was looking at something climbing up the ice wall on their side. Someone had crossed before the bridge fell. An ice axe slammed into the frozen crust of the cliff edge, inches from Major's paws. A hand, gloved in black tactical grip, hauled a body up over the rim. It was the man from the snowmobile, the one Elias had seen moving with the grace of a predator. He hadn't used the bridge. He had free-climbed the ice wall while his team provided suppressing fire. Elias didn't wait for the man to find his footing. "Get back!" Elias yelled to Martha, shoving her behind a rock. He charged. The climber, a lean man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, was fast. As he crested the ridge, he saw Elias coming. He didn't reach for the rifle slung across his back. That would take too long. Instead, he drew a combat knife from his vest in a blur of motion. Elias collided with him, not with technique, but with the raw momentum of desperation. They hit the snow hard, rolling dangerously close to the edge where the bridge had just fallen. The mercenary was stronger. He drove a knee into Elias's ribs, knocking the wind out of him, and brought the knife down. Elias caught the man's wrist. His grip was slipping on the wet synthetic fabric. The blade hovered inches from Elias's throat, the tip gleaming in the flat gray light. "You're fighting for a ghost, old man," the mercenary hissed, his breath smelling of mint and tobacco. "Give me the drive, and I make it quick." Elias couldn't speak. He was using every ounce of energy to keep the knife from severing his jugular. His arms trembled. The cold was sapping his strength. Suddenly, a black blur hit the mercenary's shoulder. Major. The dog didn't have the strength for a kill bite, but he had the weight. He slammed into the man's side, jaws snapping at the vulnerable space between the helmet and the collar. The mercenary roared, flinching away from the teeth. His balance shifted. That was all Elias needed. He twisted his hips, using the man's distraction to reverse the leverage. He drove his forehead into the mercenary's nose, a sickening crack, and rolled on top of him. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man's own knife hand and drove it down into the ice, pinning the wrist. With his free hand, he delivered 2 sharp, precise strikes to the man's throat. The mercenary gagged, his eyes rolling back. He went limp. Elias scrambled off him, chest heaving, gasping for air that felt like broken glass in his lungs. He grabbed the man's rifle, a high-end carbine, and kicked the unconscious body away from the weapon. "Elias?" Martha's voice was small, terrified. Elias stood up, wiping blood from his face. It wasn't his. "We have to go," he rasped. "Now!" He checked Major. The dog was lying in the snow, licking his bad leg. The lunge had cost him. He was whimpering softly, a sound that cut Elias deeper than the cold. I can't walk much further," Martha said, clutching her bleeding shin. Elias looked at the map in his head. The cave. It was their only chance. "You don't have to walk," Elias said. He grabbed the mercenary's tactical sled, a lightweight plastic sheet rolled up on the back of his pack, and unfurled it. He helped Martha onto it. "Hold the dog," Elias ordered. Martha pulled Major onto the sled beside her, wrapping her arms around the shivering animal. Elias grabbed the tow strap. He began to pull. The wind rose to a shriek, erasing the world around them. It was a whiteout. Visibility dropped to 0. Elias marched blindly, guided only by the slope of the land and the stubborn compass of his instinct. For an hour, he was a mule, a machine. He didn't feel his feet. He didn't feel the rope cutting into his shoulder. He only felt the weight of the 2 lives behind him. Then the ground leveled out. A dark maw appeared in the rock face ahead. The cave. Elias dragged the sled inside, collapsing onto the dry dirt floor. The wind outside turned into a distant roar. It was small, shallow, but dry. Elias fumbled with his pack, pulling out a thermal flare and cracking it. A red light flooded the stone walls, casting long dancing shadows. He crawled over to Martha. Her face was gray. The makeshift bandage on her leg was soaked through. Is it bad?" she asked, her teeth chattering. Elias peeled back the denim. The gouge was deep, but it hadn't hit the artery. The cold had actually helped, slowing the bleeding. "I can stitch it," Elias said, pulling a small medical kit from his belt. "But it's going to hurt. I don't have morphine." Martha looked at Major. The dog was curled into a tight ball against her side, sharing his body heat. She buried her hand in his fur. "Do it," she said. Elias worked quickly, his hand steady despite the exhaustion. When he finished, Martha slumped back against the rock, exhausted but alive. Elias sat back, leaning against the cave wall. He broke open a ration bar and split it 3 ways. Major ate his portion in 1 bite, then rested his head on Elias's knee. "Why?" Martha asked softly, the red light reflecting in her eyes. "You could have walked away. You could have given them the drive." Elias chewed slowly, staring at the red flare. He thought of the cabin he had built, the quiet he had fought for, the silence he had lost. "My unit," Elias said, his voice low. "We were in Afghanistan. We saw something we weren't supposed to see, a village that wasn't on the map. A contractor moving heroin in body bags." He stroked Major's ears. I reported it. They told me to let it go. I didn't. 2 weeks later, my team walked into an ambush. I was the only one who walked out. He looked at Martha. I ran away to this mountain to stop fighting. But you don't stop fighting monsters, Martha. You just wait for them to find you again. Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out the hard drive. She held it out to him. This isn't just money laundering, she whispered. Vance isn't working for a mining company. He's working for a private military firm. They're testing chemical weapons in the mines. That's how the miners died. That's what's on here. Elias froze. Chemical weapons. The gas at the cabin. It wasn't tear gas. It was a test. He looked at Major. The dog was breathing heavily, his nose dry, his eyes glassy. Major, Elias said softly. The dog didn't lift his head. Elias, Martha said, her voice rising in panic. The gas. He was in the cabin longer than us. He was closer to the floor. Elias put his hand on the dog's chest. The heartbeat was erratic, too fast. Major had absorbed the poison to guard the door. The silence of the cave was broken only by the wet, rattling sound of the dog's breathing. Elias knelt in the dirt, his survival tin held to Major's muzzle. He had melted snow over the flare's heat, mixing it with the crushed powder of a charcoal tablet from his medkit. It was a crude remedy, a desperate attempt to absorb the toxins coursing through the animal's blood. Drink, Elias whispered, his voice cracking. Come on, soldier, stay with me. Major's eyes were half closed, the amber fire dimmed to a dull haze. But at Elias's command, he forced his tongue out, lapping at the black water. He swallowed, coughed at a full-body convulsion that splattered dark mucus onto the stone, and then laid his head back on Elias's boot. Martha watched from the wall, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. He's dying, isn't he? She asked softly. Elias didn't look up. He kept his hand on Major's chest, feeling the erratic thrum of the heart. He's fighting. It's what he knows. He stroked the thick fur behind the dog's ears. If that gas was a nerve agent, he'd be dead already. It was likely a blistering agent or a lung irritant. He's drowning on the inside. Elias stood up, the movement stiff and painful. He walked to the mouth of the cave. The storm had broken. It was the worst possible outcome. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue. The sun glared off the miles of fresh snow, turning the mountain into a blinding white stage. Visibility was perfect. They'll bring air support, Elias said, more to himself than Martha. They couldn't fly in the blizzard, but now we're sitting ducks. As if summoned by his words, a sound vibrated through the thin mountain air. Thwup, thwup, thwup. Low frequency, heavy rotors. Elias threw himself back into the shadows of the cave. Get back! Cover the dog! He grabbed the silver thermal survival blanket from the sled and threw it over Martha and Major. Don't move. Don't breathe deep. It blocks your heat signature, but only if you stay perfectly still. Martha huddled over the dog, pulling the crinkling foil tight. Elias army crawled to the edge of the opening, peering through a crack in the rocks. A helicopter crested the ridge. It was black, sleek, with no registration numbers on the tail. A civilian model, but flown with military aggression. It banked hard, its nose dipped low, scanning the tree line with a sensor pod mounted under the chin. Thermal imaging. They weren't looking for footprints anymore. They were looking for body heat. The helicopter hovered over the gorge, then began to sweep west. Toward them. They know we didn't cross the plateau, Elias muttered. They're checking the pockets. He looked back at the silver lump in the corner of the cave. The blanket would hide them for a moment, but if the pilot saw the dark mouth of the cave, he would fire a rocket or a heavy round, just to be sure. Elias looked at the stolen rifle in his hands. A carbine with a holographic sight. Good for 300 yards. The helicopter was at 500 and closing. He made a choice. He crawled back to Martha. He peeled up the corner of the blanket. Listen to me, he hissed. Stay here. Do not move until you hear the rotor noise fade completely. When it's gone, you drag Major onto the sled and you head for the tree line due south. There's a ranger tower. Break the window. Use the radio on the emergency channel. Where are you going? Martha gripped his wrist. I'm going to be the decoy, Elias said. I'm going to lead them away from the cave. You'll be exposed, she cried. They'll kill you. Elias looked at Major. The dog opened one eye, looking at Elias with a heartbreaking mixture of loyalty and exhaustion. He tried to lift his head, to follow, but his body wouldn't obey. Rest, boy, Elias whispered. My watch. He pulled his wrist free from Martha's grip. Give me the drive. What? Give me the hard drive. If they catch me, I need to have it. If they catch you with it, you're dead. If I have it, they might try to take me alive." It was a lie. They wouldn't take anyone alive, but he needed her to feel safe enough to run. Martha pressed the cold metal square into his palm. "Come back," she said. Elias didn't answer. He turned and sprinted out of the cave. He didn't run away from the helicopter. He ran toward a rocky outcropping 200 yards to the east, exposing himself against the white snow. He waved his arms. The helicopter paused in its sweep. It pivoted. The nose dropped. The predator had found its prey. Elias dove behind a granite boulder just as the snow around him erupted. Zip, zip, zip! Bullets chewed into the rock, sending stone shards flying. A mounted machine gun. Elias pressed his back against the stone, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He checked the magazine on the rifle. 20 rounds. The helicopter roared overhead, banking for a strafing run. Elias closed his eyes for a second, picturing the warm cabin, the fire, the silence. Then he opened them, blue steel and ice. He stepped out from behind the rock, raised the rifle, and aimed not at the pilot, but at the tail rotor. The rifle kicked against Elias's shoulder, a rhythmic, punishing thud. 1, 2, 3. He didn't aim for the fuselage. Bullets would just bounce off the reinforced panels. He aimed for the glass eye under the helicopter's chinth thermal sensor pod. The third shot found its mark. Sparks showered from the underside of the aircraft. The black glass shattered. The helicopter bucked violently as the pilot reacted to the sudden loss of his primary targeting system. Without thermal imaging, the pilot was blind to the heat signatures hiding in the rock. He pulled hard on the stick, the machine roaring upward and banking away to the north to regroup. "Go!" Elias screamed into the wind, though he knew Martha couldn't hear him. He didn't wait to see if she moved. He turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, toward a cluster of jagged basalt spires known as the Devil's Throat. It was a suicide run, a narrow chute of rock with no exit, but it was the only place that would force the ground team to come at him single file. He dove into the shadows of the rocks just as the first bullets from the pursuing ground team chewed up the snow at his heels. Back at the cave, the silence returned, heavy and terrified. Martha peeled back the thermal blanket. The air was freezing, biting instantly at her sweat-dampened skin. "Major," she whispered, "we have to move." The dog didn't stand. He couldn't. His breathing was a wet, shallow rattle. His legs were dead weight. Martha grabbed the tow strap of the sled. She was 62 years old. She had spent her life balancing ledgers, not hauling weight through a wilderness. But as she looked at the dog, the creature that had taken a bullet of poison meant for hers, she found a reserve of strength she didn't know existed. "I am not leaving you," she grunted. She leaned forward, driving her boots into the ice, and pulled. The sled moved. Inches at first, then feet. Every step was agony. Her injured leg burned like it was on fire. The snow grabbed at the plastic sled, trying to hold them back. Drag. Breathe. Drag. Breathe. She reached the tree line. The canopy of the pines blocked the glare of the sun, offering a small mercy. She looked south. Through the gaps in the trees, she saw it. The Ranger Tower. A steel skeleton rising above the forest, a mile away. It looked impossibly far. On the sled, Major lifted his head weakly. He let out a soft whine, his nose bumping against Martha's thigh. "Keep going." "I know," Martha sobbed, wiping tears that froze on her cheeks. "I'm trying." In the Devil's Throat, Elias was out of time. He was pinned behind a slab of granite. The ground team, 4 men, moving with professional coordination, had him bracketed. He checked his pockets. 1 magazine left for the pistol. The rifle was empty. He had the knife. "Give it up, Thorne!" A voice echoed off the rocks. It was Vance. The boss himself had come down to finish it. "Come get me," Elias shouted back, his voice calm. "We don't need to get you," Vance replied. "We just need to wait. You're boxed in. And my pilot says he spots a sled track moving south. You split up. Amateur mistake." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. They saw the tracks. "You go after her," Elias yelled, "and I walk out of here and burn your whole world down." "You aren't walking anywhere," Vance laughed. A grenade landed 10 feet from Elias's position. It wasn't a frag grenade. It was a flashbang. Elias squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears, but the blast still rattled his skull. A ringing silence washed over him. He stumbled up, raising the pistol blindly. A boot kicked the gun from his hand. A rifle butt slammed into his ribs. Elias went down. He tried to rise, reaching for his knife, but a heavy boot pinned his neck to the frozen ground. The vision cleared. Vance was standing over him, wearing the same pristine parka, holding a suppressed pistol. "You fought well," Vance said, looking down at Elias with mild admiration. "For a relic." He pressed the muzzle of the gun to Elias's forehead. "Where is the drive?" Elias stared up at the gray sky. He didn't speak. He just smiled. A bloody, broken smile. "It's halfway to the internet by now," Elias lied. Vance frowned. He tapped his earpiece. "Unit 2, forget the man. Intercept the woman, use lethal force, recover the package." He looked back at Elias. "Goodbye, Mr. Thorne." Vance's finger tightened on the trigger. Suddenly, a sound cut through the air. Not a gunshot, not a scream, a siren. A long, wailing mechanical howl echoing from the south. The air raid siren from the ranger tower. Vance froze. "What is that?" he snapped. Elias's smile widened, revealing teeth red with blood. "That," Elias rasped, "is the sound of the entire valley waking up." The siren didn't just break the silence, it shattered the secrecy of the operation. In the Yukon, an emergency siren meant one thing: help is coming. Not in hours, but now. Rangers, Mounties, local pilots, everyone monitoring the emergency band would be converging on that signal. Vance's eyes flicked south for a fraction of a second. That was all Elias needed. Elias didn't try to stand. He torqued his hips, driving his boot into Vance's knee with the force of a piston. Bone crunched. Vance screamed, his aim faltering. The suppressed pistol fired into the snow inches from Elias's ear. Elias lunged upward. He grabbed Vance's wrist with both hands, twisting it violently against the joint. The pistol flew from the mercenary's grip, skittering across the ice. Vance was big, and he was trained, but he was fighting a man who had nothing left to lose. Elias drove his shoulder into Vance's solar plexus, tackling him onto the frozen granite. They rolled. Fists struck flesh. It was ugly, desperate, and fast. Vance managed to draw a combat knife from his vest. He slashed, opening a gash on Elias's forearm. Elias didn't flinch. He caught the knife arm, locking it. He looked into Vance's eyes that suddenly held the realization that money couldn't buy survival here. "You should have stayed in the city," Elias grunted. He reversed the blade. It was over in seconds. Vance slumped back against the rock, the fight leaving him as the blood pooled dark and steaming on the white snow. Elias rolled away, gasping, clutching his bleeding arm. He grabbed the fallen radio from Vance's chest. "Boss, talk to us. The sirens, we have bogies inbound. 2 choppers, RCMP markings. We are aborting. Repeat, we are aborting." The mercenaries were cutting their losses. They were leaving. Elias didn't reply. He crushed the radio under his boot. He stood up. The world swayed. His vision was tunneling, black spots dancing at the edges. He was bleeding from 3 different wounds, freezing and exhausted. But he wasn't done. "Martha," he whispered. He began to run. It was a stumbling, broken run, dragging his leg, but he moved toward the siren's wail like a moth to a flame. It took him 20 minutes to reach the tree line. Every step was a battle against gravity. He saw the ranger tower rising above the trees. The glass in the cabin at the top was shattered. "Martha," he yelled, his voice raw. No answer. The siren continued its mechanical scream. Elias climbed the steel ladder. His hands were numb blocks of ice. He slipped once, catching himself on a rung, screaming in pain as his injured arm took the weight. He pulled himself up. He kicked open the trap door to the tower cab. Martha was there. She was slumped against the radio console, her hands still gripping the manual override lever for the siren. She was unconscious, her face pale as death. And lying across her legs, keeping her warm, was Major. The dog did not move. His eyes were closed. There was no rise and fall of his chest. Elias fell to his knees. The silence inside the cab was deafening, even over the siren outside. He crawled to them. He checked Martha's pulse. Thready, weak, but there. She was alive. Hypothermia and shock, but alive. He turned to Major. Elias placed his hand on the thick fur of the dog's neck. He waited. He prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Nothing. Then, a tremor. A tiny, faint beat against his fingertips. Thump, thump. The dog let out a shallow breath, a whisper of air from the nose. Elias choked back a sob. He pulled the 2 of them into his arms, huddling in the center of the tower floor, surrounded by broken glass and the howling wind. Through the shattered windows, he saw lights in the sky, blue and red strobes cutting through the daylight, 2 helicopters descending. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They hovered over the clearing, kicking up a storm of snow. Men in tactical gear were rappelling down. Elias didn't wave, he didn't stand. He just held the old woman and the dying dog, and he closed his eyes. The war was over. 3 weeks later, the silence in the hospital room was different from the silence on the mountain. It smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, not pine and blood. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, buttoning a flannel shirt that felt too stiff. His arm was in a sling, his ribs taped tight. The doctor had called his survival statistically improbable. Elias called it stubbornness. The door opened. Martha walked in. She looked different. The fear that had etched deep lines into her face was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary dignity. She leaned on a cane, her leg bandaged beneath her trousers, but she stood tall. "I saw the news," Elias said, nodding toward the television mounted on the wall. Martha smiled faintly. "Cobalt mining is dissolving. The federal investigation started yesterday. The hard drive had everything. Bribes, the chemical reports, the kill orders." She paused. "Vance's body was recovered. They're calling it a security contractor dispute. The world doesn't need to know the rest." Elias nodded. He didn't care about the credit. He cared that the hunting was over. "I have something for you," Martha said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather collar. It was new, sturdy, with a brass nameplate. Elias's chest tightened. "Martha." "He's in the lobby," she said. "The vet discharged him this morning. His lungs are scarred, Elias. He'll never run a marathon again. He wheezes when he sleeps. But he's standing." Elias walked out of the room, ignoring the ache in his ribs. In the waiting area, sitting patiently beside a potted plant, was Major. The German shepherd looked thinner. Patches of fur were shaved where IVs had been. His breathing was audible, a soft rasp with every exhale. But when he saw Elias, his ears snapped forward. He didn't run. He couldn't. He stood up slowly, favoring his bad leg, and walked over. He pressed his heavy head against Elias's good thigh and let out a long, shuddering sigh. Elias buried his hand in the dog's fur, closing his eyes. He felt the coarse hair, the warmth, the heartbeat that had almost stopped in a cold tower. "He needs a home," Martha said, stepping up beside them. "My house in the city, it's too small, too loud. He hates the noise." She looked at Elias. "I have a property," she continued, her voice tentative. "About 40 miles south of your ridge, lower elevation, less snow. There's a guest cabin that needs fixing, and a main house that feels too big for one old woman." Elias looked at her. He had spent 10 years running away from people, building walls of ice and silence. But the mountain had burned down. The walls were gone. He looked down at Major. The dog looked up, amber eyes waiting for the command. What is the mission? The mission had changed. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about living. "Does it have a fireplace?" Elias asked. Martha smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached her eyes. "It has too." Elias clipped the new leather collar around Major's neck. The brass tag caught the light. "Let's go home," Elias said. Major let out a soft woof and limped toward the automatic doors, leading the way.